1:30, the Board of County Commissioners workshop on the budget will convene, but if we could rise and do the Pledge of Allegiance, I appreciate that. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all. I'll turn this over to our county manager.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, Commissioners, everyone. Today would be our second draft of the fiscal year 21-22 continuation budget. And one of the things that Pete will talk with you about is by the time we finish this conversation today, if there are additional things you want to consider for this budget and require a one more workshop, we are prepared to do that. Otherwise, once we finish today, we would, and if there are no changes, we would recommend just going straight to public hearing next month. Pete?
All right, thank you, Roger. Good afternoon, Commissioners, and we'll just get right into it. This is your second look at the continuation budget. You've had a number of budget workshops early in the year dealing with other issues, and I'll go through the schedule in a second here. So the agenda today is kind of the schedule of where we've been and where we're going with the budget development. We'll spend a lot of time on the changes since June 15th, since the first budget workshop on the continuation budget. Our recommendations to you having to do with budget issues, as well as you're going to set the maximum millage rates at 5 o'clock. So we'll be making some recommendations on that. I'll show you some 5-year modeling related to that. We're going to talk a little bit about some good things happening in human services, and then questions at the end. So shaded in blue is where we've come from on the budget budget workshops and the budget development. And then here we are at August 3rd with the second draft of the continuation budget. And then at 5 this evening, you'll set the maximum millage rates for the property tax rates for the coming year, which means that those rates going into public hearings can be lowered, but they cannot be increased after today. And then, as Roger said, a third draft if we need it at the end of this, or we can go directly into public hearings, which will be September 7th and September 21st. And then the questions at the end is there anything else you would like to consider in this budget? And then should we proceed to a third draft, or you want to proceed directly to public hearings? So this slide we'll spend some time on because this shows the changes since June 15th, when you had a pretty extensive workshop on your first draft of the continuation operating budget. A couple weeks before that, we delved into the construction budget. So what's happened since June 15th is in June 1st, you had your preliminary property tax base assessments, and then July 1st, you have the final assessments. So what this shows is your 4 main property tax funds, the property tax increase in each of those funds, property tax base increase in those funds at June 1st, and then you can see with the preliminary assessment, and then you can see the final assessment on July 1st. All of those initial assessments increased between June and July. And then what shows in the right-hand column is the additional revenue just that month between the preliminary and final assessment generated. So it generated additional 4.8 in the general fund, 4.8 million, and then you can see in the other funds. There's some recommendations that we're making today to you based on some input that some of you commissioners gave us. Both at when we went June 1st, when we went through the capital improvement plan, and then also at our operating budget. Commissioner Mann, and these are recommendations that we're making today, changes to the capital improvement plan. So Commissioner Mann, you had requested a little quicker access into GS10 for recreation, and so Jesse Lavender in Parks and Recreation can build a kayak launch at that site, within several months after the fiscal year begins, and that's a $26,000 expense. We talked about, Commissioner Hammond, you talked about shade structures. If we could accelerate the construction of shade structures in all of our parks and playgrounds and ball fields. And that cost is $5.4 million, and our recommendation was to split that over 3 years at $1.8 million a year and take that from excess reserves. Commissioner, you did have a question whether that could all be done in 1 year, and realistically, it probably would take at least 2 years, if not 3, just to get that completed. Commissioner Pendergrass, the Ruttenberg Library demolition, pickleball courts, construction of pickleball courts at Ruttenberg Park. That was in the out years. We do have enough community park impact fees to begin that project immediately. So what we've done is we've put into the capital improvement plan design and demolition, design of the pickleball courts and demolition of the old library in fiscal year 21-22, and then construction in fiscal year 22-23. And then I'm going to talk about a few projects here and how we're repurposing some funds that already exist in other accounts to pay for at least the initial parts of these projects. One is the recreation element of Larry Kiker Preserve. So Larry Kiker Preserve is going to have both a recreation element to it, opening up access to both locals and to visitors. And then there will be there's a natural resources part of it, which is going to be a berm that is a water retention, stormwater, flood protection type of project. For the parks element, we are recommending that we use $6 million that exists in an account that we had set aside with tourist taxes for the development player development complex, with the city of Fort Myers. That project is no longer a viable project, and what we're recommending, and will be going to the Tourist Development Council, is to take those funds from that account and reallocate them to the initial phase of Larry Kiker Preserve. We know that the recreation element of that will cost more than $6 million, probably multiples of that. But right now, without having a design, we really don't know the total cost. So right now, we've just put in that $6 million in the capital improvement plan. Larry Kiker Preserve, the natural resources portion of that, there's design already programmed in the CIP for next year. And then in fiscal year 23-24 is the construction of that. It's an $8.6 million project. And we're looking at that potentially to use American Rescue Plan funds to pay for that. Natural resources, there are ongoing water quality projects. That typically is a transfer from the general fund because natural resources does not have its own funding source. We are not doing a transfer from the general fund this year because we had collected in a Caloosahatchee River Basin TMDL account, total maximum daily load account, of several $1 million in order to pay for water quality projects in the Caloosahatchee Basin. Because we've met our Basin Management Action Plan and our TMDL requirements in that basin, we are continuing to do water quality projects, but instead of building funds into that account, what we want to do is use those funds for the water quality projects that Natural Resources and Roland and his team have planned in the upcoming years. Lakes Park, there's a number of them, water quality projects. And then Lavender's Landing, we were looking at replacing the structures out there, the little apartments out there for overnight stays and rentals. That would be a fairly extensive project, probably rebuilding all of those. And at this point, our recommendation is to remove that from the CIP and actually turn that area into parking. So those are our CIP recommended changes from June 15th. Are there any questions?
bring up something, it's not about this list, although this is perfect, but a couple months ago, we were in an MPO meeting, I believe, myself and Commissioner Mann, and there's a project I was gonna bring up for the future, we can talk about it, Buckingham Road, I think it is, and it's a roundabout that's been out there waiting, you've been waiting, I think you said, Commissioner Mann, like 10 years for a roundabout, and the state was still saying it's 5 years out, or 10 more years out or something, so in the future, I'd like to maybe talk about getting some extra funding for that, or at least, we had mentioned that, remember that roundabout, Buckingham Road in Gunnery, or no? Yeah, it might be a state funding type, though, but
They've got it, but it's like forever.
right, you were saying it's been talked about for 10 years, and it's still like 8 years out, so.
Yeah, yeah.
In the future, we'll talk about that maybe next year, but if you want to bring it up, I'll be happy to support that in the future, so.
Well, that's mighty kind, because that's still a scary, what is our role so far in that proposed roundabout there?
We met with the designer a couple days ago, we have the design in place, and they've identified 2 major pieces of rights-of-way that we need to acquire. So the state, through the state process, is starting to acquire those rights-of-way. It shouldn't be 10 years down the road, depending on funding.
Well, you were at the last MPO meeting with us, but it seemed to me that it was extended far beyond what's reasonable for all the blessings we've given it and energy.
Yeah, again, once they acquire or lock in those 2 pieces of right-of-way,
Well, who's paying for this? Is the state paying for it?
state's paying for,
I know it's just, the cost wasn't that much for a roundabout, but it was just, like Randy said, it's a state project, so it's very frustrating when we're here, been waiting, 18 years total for a project like that, when we're doing them across all the time, so. It's great, I mean, it's great for the state to pay for it, but like Randy said, there's a process they're going through, unless, I don't know, we in the future could chip in, maybe to expedite the process, or maybe the process, help them with the process to get through it, but something to talk about later in the year, I guess, but.
Well,
I know it came up recently, and you and me both were at that meeting, and we, so we couldn't talk about it until now.
very much bringing it up even here, just to keep us aware of the status of it, because I knew from our last meeting at the MPO that the state's got that, but I have mentioned at the MPOs how dangerous that intersection is, where the 2 roads just come slapped together, and you better hope that the other guy stops.
Right, that's what I'm saying, it's a dangerous, a very
So,
dangerous situation.
I hope then we can sort of do one of those little dog heads nodding up and down at the next MPO too, because they've listened to you. Sure. And would you join us?
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, and maybe Randy, you could shed some light on this. Is there a mechanism where if we had the funds to help pay for construction now, that FDOT could pay us back later in the year that they have it budgeted for?
we used to do that often, it's called advancement reimbursement, that the state has ceased doing that for the time being. They could start any time, but they ceased now because they're afraid of the veto power, and they make it a commitment, and then they can't hold up their end of it. But I think, Roger, you and I are talking to Jerry Kantz from FDOT here coming up over their work program.
I think maybe next week.
Right, and wondering maybe we can put a word in and see if we can juggle some projects around or something.
I think if I'm right, the road, Buckingham is a county road, but I think this is part of one of the 18 roundabouts years ago, the state and the county approved it through the MPO process, identified one of the intersections, right, Randy? So it's a county road, but it's part of those one of those 18 that was identified as obviously a hazard. So, anyway, we'll talk about that later, but.
Accepted their help, we might have had it done by now.
Yeah, probably 5 years ago, yes.
So, yeah, thank you very much. Go with God, my son, and talk to them.
Sorry, I didn't want to get off track of this. This is a great presentation. I just wanted to bring that up because we haven't able to.
The kayak thing, I want to express my profound gratitude for that $26,000. And I know that was a major effort in shifting the millions of dollars around to get the 26,000. But that's where we had nothing planned for a decade out there. But we had just bought that GS-10, and it's got such potential to become what I've been referring to as Lakes Park East. And where's my little hero back there? Lavender?
Don't call him hero.
He gets, his head swells and all that. Well, it should.
He's pretty tough to live
He
with.
found that $26,000 all by himself, man. That's hard to find this
Way to
time
go,
of year.
Jesse. Way to go.
But it
They don't
is-
call him Mr. Christmas for nothing.
That land came with some water, and it's perfect for my dream, as many of you heard me talk about this, for the grandpa to take his granddaughters out there or go kayaking or fishing. He's gonna have a little fishing dock out of that and a parking space. It's amazing what you can do with $26,000 when you already got the water there. And I am profoundly grateful for that, because that kind of gets the foot in the door, and we'll continue to, you'll hear me chat about that for the next couple of years too.
Commissioner, remember how we have nicknamed Jesse Mr. Christmas?
Yes, there
Well,
is.
what he hasn't told you about that $26,000, that's coming right out of his pocket.
What a guy.
Isn't that something? Yeah, yeah.
Well, we've got something named for his father. Let's see if we can name a kayak here for, I'm very grateful, Pete, and I know you had to sign off on it. Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask something that I didn't think about during my briefing, but since we're on the parks and the shade structure, first of all, thank you so much for coming up with a plan to get those done in 3 years. I think moms, parents all over, grandparents all over the county are going to rejoice when we get that shade out there. I think that's important. One question I was going to ask is, there's been a great group that does shuffleboards out at the North Fort Myers Recreation Center that talked to me about maybe some sort of a sun shelter for the shuffleboards out there. Is it possible we can work that into this shade structure program?
Yeah, Jesse, what do you think?
We did not anticipate that request, so this dollar figure does not encompass that extra work. And we can, I mean, certainly, so.
It just seems like it would be the appropriate time to start to look at that, and I don't know if Mr. Harner, if you guys can get together and talk about the idea of working that in there as well. It's a great group. They love their shuffleboard at the North Fort Myers Rec Center, and, you know, they're very concerned about skin cancer and their susceptibility to that, and so if there's a way to get a shade structure for those shuffleboard courts out there. They even have, believe it or not, some tournaments from time to time at that shuffleboard court, so I'd appreciate seeing that.
Sure.
Well, while the hero is here,
Oh, God.
in case folks in Lehigh were thinking, 26,000 is all we're gonna get out of this budget this year, remind us what we're doing with a 40-acre addition to the park on Williams Road, and that's substantial dollars there.
Yes, sir. That's almost $12 million in an upgrade to the existing park that's out there. That'll be 3 football fields, walking trails, pickleball courts, disc golf course, place to go take your granddaughter fishing, pavilions, and other amenities, as well as meeting the need of having sufficient parking in that area, so.
Thank you. I wanted to point out the 10 or 12 million, so you get,
Commissioner, before we leave this topic, on the, you know, the subject of shade structure at the shuffleboard parks, with your permission, if, we'll just have Chris, if you'll get your folks together and price that for us. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys, appreciate that.
No problem.
Okay, Commissioners, and then next, and you'll see some of these projects again, but each year, we recommend funding a certain number of projects from excess reserves. As a matter of routine for like the sheriff's capital, it works better that way so that the sheriff doesn't have to build their capital into their operating budget, because that goes up and down, and it kind of gets, we don't want it to get lost in there, and he doesn't either. So the sheriff's capital of $9.9 million, that's primarily replacement vehicles, technology items, and 1.4 million of that is the annual expense on a financing all of the digital radios that they purchased to be compatible with our new digital emergency radio system. We put in a placeholder for the clerk's financial management software, which the clerk uses to pay our bills and which we also use at the county to keep track of budget and other items. That's $1.25 million. Currently, it's undergoing a review with Gartner on the best financial software to come up with, but we're putting that in. The clerk has requested that. It'd be another $1.25 million the following year also. Supervisor of Elections has a large capital item that they've requested, that Tommy Doyle has requested, be paid from excess reserves. Those are express vote devices, one for each of the polling places. Those are ADA compatible devices. The Justice Center proper, which is the old Justice Center building right across from County Administration, across Monroe there. That building is 40 years old. The plumbing has reached the end of its useful life. We're going to have to do a complete plumbing replacement in that building. And because of the size of that project, it's in our major maintenance program out of the general fund. But because of the size of that, we are recommending we pay that out of excess reserves. That keeps a little more capacity in the general fund because we don't have a project of that size in the future years, at least at this point. Then as we talked about, the kayak launch, the shade structures, and then Conservation 2020 replenishment. Right now, we're at about $33 million and change in the Conservation 2020 acquisition fund. Another $7 million would bring that up to the minimum level of $40 million. That could change slightly by the end of the year, but wouldn't be by much. And what we'll do is we'll come back and tell you exactly what that's going to cost to bring it up to $40 million. So when you add that all together, that's $24.7 million, which is pretty typical for a year of spending out of excess reserves. Just really briefly, this is the taxable property values, taxable property base since pre-recession. So you can see that as of this year at $96.2 billion in taxable value, we are back to where we were just before the recession in 2007, 2008. And then the following 5 years, that's a projection from the state of Florida. It's the State Revenue Estimating Conference, which does a property tax base estimate for all of the counties. And you can see Lee County's estimate going forward, property tax base, 4.7%. It's a long range estimate, or a longer range estimate, 4.7%, 4.7, 4.4, 4.1, 4.0. One thing I want to point out, I'm going to show you some projections coming up in the general fund, the unincorporated MSTU fund, and the library fund. And for purposes of those projections, we've used this state estimate and added 1% to each of those years because we typically are above that projection by at least 1%, if not a couple percent. So this is where we end up in the general fund. And what the board had requested June 15th was show us what the rollback rate would look like and what the general fund would look like if you were to reduce the property tax rate to the rollback rate. And the rollback rate is the rate at which you're collecting basically the same amount of property tax revenues this year as you did last year, plus your new construction. You get benefit of the new construction. So the rollback rate is, right now, the general fund property tax rate is 4.0506. The rollback rate would be 3.8623, so almost 0.2 of a mil. Your revenue at the rollback rate would be $497.1 million, expense of $502.6 million, and so a slight deficit of $5.5 million. When I say a slight deficit, with the general fund expenses of $500 million, that's 1%. And something I want to make clear also is that when you go to the rollback, you expect that you are going to have a slight deficit for a while. The question is how quickly do you grow out of that? So on this chart, what I'd like to do is go down to the very bottom real quickly. Reserves at 17%. So commissioners, at the June 15th workshop, you talked about the 20% minimum reserve level we keep in the general fund and wanted to reduce that to 17%, just on the basis of 20% conservative, and that would free up some funds to do things with. So that difference between 20% of general fund reserves, a 20% level, and 17%, that's about a $15 million difference. So as you're holding about $100 million in general fund reserves now, at 70%, you would hold $85 million, which would free up $15 million of capacity. Another thing I wanted to point out is you can see in the shaded that adjust the reserve for revenue stabilization. So at the beginning of this fiscal year, and actually when you developed the budget, it was before that during the summer, there were questions about the impact that the coronavirus pandemic would have both on the general economy and then on county revenues. So the board set aside $6 million as a revenue stabilization fund. So it's a separate reserve within general fund for revenue stabilization. So when we talk about covering that continuation deficit, you can look at either you're doing that out of the difference between your 20% and your 17% and your minimum level of general fund reserves, or out of this reserve for revenue stabilization. So I just wanted to make that point clear, that those are reserves that we have collected up to this date. They have nothing to do with CARES Act reimbursements or anything else.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Commissioners, the point that Pete was just making really is a very important one, particularly for those who might be listening. And the general concept of deficit, usually means that you're not generating enough revenue to pay your bills. And in this case, that's not exactly true. At that millage rate, property tax does not generate enough dollars to pay the bills. But when you add these other revenues available to us or already in the general fund that are being repurposed, we more than cover that $5.5 billion deficit. So it's not a true deficit. It's not a deficit in the true sense of the word.
One of the point, and I appreciate that, Roger, very much, but you're also going into this upcoming budget with some pretty conservative estimates, not only for property values, which obviously we just saw what 1% did, 1.3%, obviously another $4.7 million. So even though you're at 4.7, you gave it to 5.7. If we came in at 7.7, here you're looking at about a $9 million swing. The other thing that we had going in our favor was sales tax, which obviously sales tax has been trending much higher, again, conservative estimates. So I see what's in black and white, but I also recognize that the projections and estimates are rather conservative, and there's a higher probability that we probably won't go deficit at all.
That's absolutely correct, Commissioner. And as we get into this next session, I'll show you how we may even generate a few more revenues. So then getting into our excess reserves, or our undesignated reserves in the general fund, they were projected at $111.5 million. As we discussed earlier, we projected back in the summer of COVID, 2020, a significant reduction in sales tax revenue, $43 million. And we are trending at least $10 million more than that this year. And just the latest numbers that came out for July, I would estimate that we may actually generate maybe $56 million in sales tax sharing this year. So that's an additional $3 million to this $10 million if that happens. Reimbursements for response to COVID, vaccinations, public safety reimbursements for running our CARES Act programs, $22.2 million. So you have adjusted reserves of $138 million. If you add in that reserve for revenue stabilization, you have total reserves of $144 million. Your reserves at 17% are $85 million. So you have remaining excess of $58.7 million remember, which we're recommending about $25 million of that we use this year for those projects I just talked about.
Real quick, Pete, could I jump in before you leave that slide? So the line that is shaded that says reserve for revenue stabilization, that is the $6 million that we set aside last year in case something happened with property values, you know, and we needed some money to satisfy a deficit or something like that because property values went down. Instead, they went up and things outperformed. What is your plan for the reserve for revenue stabilization over the next year? And do you project that we'll see this line in the budget next year as well, or do you plan to use this?
I would plan to, our recommendation would be to get rid of that separate designation. It would just be part of excess reserves.
Okay.
Pete, just to follow up, so really what it does is give us a total reserves of 144. You know, and I think, I heard what you said about reserves at 17%. I think it's really important to understand just how much this budget has grown. So 20% in 2010 was a number. With the budget growing, you know, the last 11 years, 17% is still a greater number that we're having in reserves. It's just obviously proportionate to the size of our budget.
Right.
Just wanted to make sure that was clear for the record.
That's correct, and I'll show you that in the next couple slides. So
So
Yeah,
I should
what-
just let you go.
So the next
What I was looking
couple.
for was just to make sure we didn't have that recurring designation of 6 million every year.
Great question.
Right.
Sounds like we're taking care of that. Makes sense.
So what this projection shows is your general fund at the rollback rate, 3.8623. We're using the state revenue estimating conference projections, 5-year projection going forward, and adding 1%. So next year instead of 4.7, it'd be 5.7, 5.7, 5.4, 5.1. So what this shows is your total revenues, your total expenditures, your total reserves, and then your that line at the bottom, the dotted dark blue line, is your reserves at 17%. So you can see at this projection, like I said, you run a slight deficit, but your total reserves never go below 17%. And then after we pay off our general fund debt, which is a significant burden over these next few years, it's gone up quite a bit just because of the debt schedule that we entered into many years ago. Once that's paid off in 25, 26, you can see that your reserves then begin to build, and your percentage above 17% begins to build fairly significantly. So you can see there your total ending reserve in 28, 29, if you want to go out that many years, is 179 million. Your reserves at 17% would be 109 million. And at some point, and we've talked about this before, because your general fund expenses are going up each year, whether it was the 20% or now that 17%, that 17% in real dollars is a larger and larger number. So we've talked about in the past of, you know, how much over $100 million do you need to maintain in reserves at any given time? So that just gives you an indication of what that looks like.
Pete, when did the revenue estimating conference last meet?
March,
In March?
yeah, and they will meet again before the end of the year.
So I had a question on this model, kind of just looking at the assumptions then. So on the previous slide, we saw that our remaining excess above 17% was 58.7 million. And then looking at the model then in the reserve line here, it looks like to balance the budget, are you using that 58.7 million to balance the budget for the next several years?
No, you're not. So what you're not using, and I'll go back, that's a good question, Commissioner. What you're not using is we haven't adjusted this yet for the sales tax sharing, that increase. We haven't made that adjustment. And you're not using any of that 22.2 million that you received in CARES Act reimbursements.
Okay. So what happens to the 58.7? Is that money that we could use for projects, or is that money that we're going to need to balance the budget for the next few years while we, at the new millage rate?
Some of it is balancing the budget, but a big part of it is for projects.
And I think we really don't know, we're doing the best best projection we can, conservative-wise. Obviously, if we follow the trends we've been following, there won't be anything. If anything, that excess reserve will be higher.
Yeah, and you, Commissioner, you got a little ahead of me, but I'll show you in this next projection, probably a little more realistic projection, not quite as conservative, this is the same projection that you just saw, rolled back at 3.8623. However, for fiscal year 22-23, you're assuming an increase in the tax base that is the same as this year. So instead of that 5.7, it's 7.69, just based on where the housing market is, where prices are right now. So if you were to do that, so let's have it at, we did the 7.69% increase this year. Let's say it's going to be the same or close to the same next year, then go back to the state projection plus 1%. You can see what happens there. What happens there is you basically run that deficit for a year and a half, if that, and you can see your lowest line, that's the 70% minimum reserve. You never dip below a 20% reserve in that scenario. And in that scenario, then you would be generating more excess reserves. So when you talk about the 58 million, we're using some this year. Yes, we may have to use some with regards to the deficit, but maybe not much at all. And then you'll be generating more reserves. So it's kind of a fluid thing as it goes forward.
So Commissioners, as part of this conversation, we'll recall that the property values that the property appraiser gives us are as of January 1 this year. So it is based on all the sales and transactions from the last year. If you think about what the current real estate market looks like and has been for the last, 6 months, maybe, give or take, we are using really pretty conservative estimates right now. So that the model that Pete just described for you, the last one, is assuming that we get the same increase next year as this year in property values. And I'd be willing to bet a bunch that it's going to be higher than that for sure. So that year and a half to grow out of the deficit position, it could be much sooner than that.
I agree with you that this is a more likely scenario based on what we're seeing in the real estate market currently. So that leads me to a question of when is the appropriate time and what would be the appropriate time to look at budgeting that $58 million in excess reserves? So if we think we're going to have it as excess reserves, then at what point do we budget it and put it to work as opposed to let it just sit in the savings account?
Pete?
Well, Commissioner, so with one caveat, 25 of that million you're using this coming year, because I've showed you that. I think that's really up to the board based on, how the economy tracks and how revenues are coming in. I can keep you apprised on how coming in. So I certainly think that's a discussion that can be had anytime. I'm not sure I'd have that before September 30th, before this budget.
Yeah, Commissioner, with your permission, we'd like to give that a little thought as we get closer towards the end of this fiscal year and public hearings. And that requires some pretty good think time with the group.
Okay, yeah.
This kind of goes off, I think, what Commissioner Hammond talked about the excess reserve, but also we talked about it in our strategic planning this year, a few months ago. We talked about how, for example, we're doing a lot of great projects here, getting money to facilitate the sheriff's budget, the payroll procedure. We get a lot of progress finished, completed, but we also thought we need things done ahead of time, like road projects, access fund. So was it permitting, was it design, or was it funding for some of these road projects?
Yep.
We were thinking, you were saying with the excess reserve, we're looking ahead, a year ahead, 2 years ahead, working, how can we get that money back in the community as fast as possible? To create some, obviously, we do a lot of things here from kayak ramp, launches to parks,
Right.
correct, to roads, so all that stuff's really important in our community, it also creates jobs, when we're using that money for the stagnant account. We need reserves, want reserves, but also it's really get the money back to the community, and she'll put some product and show to the community.
Yes, sir, we understand, and the whole schedule for all the road projects that we've been talking about, it's a combination of, timing and dollars. It's, time for whether we've got a PD&E process or just design, then build, and, are we gonna have to borrow money, or how much of it will we be able to continue to do pay-as-you-go? So all of that is what we'll be considering when we come back with the next conversation on those additional dollars.
Okay, thank you.
One other point for the record, and I think I want to make sure it's clear, is as we went through the initial proposed budget and the estimate to the final, it flows through your chart that you have where it shows $144 million in total reserves. So the $58 million is really a byproduct of that 7.69% increase, no different than the sales tax. So it's really that revenues were trending higher, enabling us to have more dollars available to look at and say, okay, do we do projects? Do we do roads? Do we pay down debt? What's the best utilization of this? But what we're talking about is, not only reducing the millage rate, what we're talking about is doing an awful lot of projects, correcting things from the past to the sheriff's budget to make sure, they have much more, the compression, the things they're doing. I mean, we're doing an awful lot, and even at Commissioner Hammond's point, there's still a lot of opportunity in Commissioner Pendergrass that we can sit as a board. I mean, we're in a really good place of reducing the millage rate, taking care of a lot of projects, addressing things that we haven't been able to do so, playing catch-up ball, and we still have some pretty good decisions in front of us. So the way I look at it is that excess reserves is really flowing through from that 7.69% for that additional sales tax. And that's only going to go larger because July's sales tax will be higher. So that number is only going to be bigger. And you still have $25 million worth of projects you're doing on the prior page, and we still have a lot of money left over. I just think it's just for clarity purposes. I mean, we're doing an awful lot of things, and we still have a lot of good things we can talk about.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Just by way, just a suggestion to kind of throw against the wall is maybe that strategic planning session, that is a good topic where we talk about the excess reserves and what we might use them for.
Yes, sir.
And Commissioners, this is just a historical chart that you've seen before. It just shows you general fund budget, our ending reserves each year, our excess reserves invested. Like I said, it's pretty typical to have 20 million or close to it plus, as you can see over the last several years. And then your growth increment funding, which is still built into your general fund operating budget. That's paid out of your continuing operating budget. It's not paid out of reserves. So when you add all the excess reserves invested, and this is most of them, and then we've had some kind of one-time revenue investments based on some things that have happened, like several years we received some BP oil spill money. But when you add that and along with the growth increment funding over the last 6 or 7 years, that's $191 million of invested with additional investment with no adjustments to increases in tax rates or anything like that.
Amazing.
And this is, it's in your backup. It's hard to read, but this just shows you each year those projects in which you invested both growth increment funding and then excess reserves. Now moving on to the other funds. So we've been through the general fund, and you can see with the other main property tax funds, library, unincorporated, MSTU, all hazards, those all have increased from 2021 and actually increased from the June 1st estimate, as you saw earlier on in this presentation. Unincorporated MSTU is a fund that is balanced, but it's barely balanced. And just keeping in mind that this fund, not too long ago, was running an $18 million deficit. So that has been corrected over the last couple of years. But this fund also has a number of pressures on it. One being is that's where funding, a big portion of funding for our DOT operations resides, a transfer from the unincorporated MSTU fund. And their budget has increased because of the aging of some of the road network infrastructure, the new roads we're putting in, maintenance of those, landscaping, et cetera, canal cleaning, certainly a bigger effort since Hurricane Irma. So all of that gives you your unincorporated MSTU fund expenses. So I'm going to show you the same type of projection for the unincorporated MSTU. The unincorporated MSTU millage rate is 0.8398. And what you're seeing here is the tax base increase projected by the State Revenue Estimating Conference plus 1%. So you can see that your total revenues and your total expenditures are just right, almost even. So you're basically balanced. And you're running about you're trying to run about a 10% minimum reserve. It certainly doesn't need as high a reserve as the general fund, but it is a large fund and does require reserves. So that is at your current millage rate. We did a rollback scenario for this fund. The rollback would be 0.7986. And what you see here is you are running then a deficit, unlike in the general fund. It doesn't correct itself in a short period of time. It just continues to run about a $1 to $2 million deficit each year. And at the rollback rate, what would happen is you would never build back your reserves. You would just be covering that deficit with your reserves. So you'd eventually end up in the negative. So our recommendation for the unincorporated MSTU fund would be to keep the millage rate at its current rate.
So, Commissioners, and just one thing to think about in this, the countywide MSTU and the value of the properties. You know, some of these properties are looking pretty good to some of the cities, and they've talked about annexing some of these properties, and I want us to be very cautious about going silent if that's going to affect our ability to pay for expenses in the unincorporated MSTU. We don't get a lot of say-so when that happens, but you know, we've heard some conversation from some cities lately about the desirability of some of these properties that have increased in values that are contiguous to those city boundaries. And I just want us to be cognizant of that, because if we start losing those property values to the cities, then you know this fund is going to have a much larger problem. Where I used to work, we eventually had only about 3% of the unincorporated, 3% of the county was unincorporated, and it caused, trying to balance that was almost an impossible task.
I appreciate you bringing that up, Roger. Commissioners, you may have seen last night on Wink News, somebody came to me this morning and said, did you see what the mayor said about the mayor of Fort Myers said about wanting to incorporate North Fort Myers into the Fort Myers city limits? And I said, no, I didn't see that. And I assumed maybe he had made some sort of off-the-cuff remark that was maybe taken out of context. But no, he did an actual sit-down interview with a Wink News reporter saying, no, we would like to look at annexing North Fort Myers into the city of Fort Myers. We think that we could do more for them, but to provide more development and things like that. And so I was surprised, and I just want to publicly say that is not something I would support. And I don't think the community of North Fort Myers would support as well, being annexed into the city of Fort Myers. And one of the things that you can see a major difference for North Fort Myers would be the current millage rate that they pay to the unincorporated MSTU is 83, almost 84 cents per thousand of taxable value. If they went into the city of Fort Myers, what is the millage rate for the city of Fort Myers?
It's around,
Almost 8 mils.
it's 8 mils.
So they'll go from 84 cents per thousand to almost $8 per thousand.
Plus the county taxes too.
You know,
Yeah.
to your point, Commissioner, what most areas do is they go through that financial feasibility study, okay? Even some of them, Pine Island, an area I represent, and when you do the infrastructure, when you look at the long-term expenses you have, it's generally not financially feasible. Even when you have areas that have more, obviously a greater taxable value where you have the opportunity, but some of the other areas, I think the reality is, I know everyone's frustrated to get their bang for the buck, but when you do the math doesn't work. You can certainly be your own entity, but at what expense?
Right.
And are you willing to endure that expense? To your point, it's a 1,000% increase for them to be part of Fort Myers. I mean, let's just understand, you know, what you're talking about. Financially, I don't know, I wouldn't want to sell that to a taxpayer.
Well, the good thing is the residents of North Fort Myers get to make that choice. I don't think they would choose to do that based upon the record and the history of the city of Fort Myers with taxation, crime, and everything else. So I think they would rather choose to stay where they're at.
Thanks. Appreciate your
point.
support on that, though. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioners, and then our final major property tax fund that we want to talk about is the library millage. The library millage is almost a county-wide millage. It's paid by everybody in the county and in the cities except for town of Fort Myers Beach and the city of Sanibel, which they each have their own system. This shows the current millage rate, 0.4956, and it shows where their reserves are today and where they would end up in a 5-year projection. Now, one thing I do want to point out for the library fund, it's a little different than unincorporated MSTU and the general fund in that the library fund acts as both an operating fund and a fund to pay for construction projects. So you're going to typically run a higher reserve there because you need that to do construction projects. But if we do a projection out, you can see that the library projects that you have in the early years, you are actually paying some of that, you're paying those out of reserves. That's why you see expenditures above revenues. But then once you complete those projects, and those projects are the Riverdale Library renovation, the South County Library major renovation, and then the relocation of the library administration from where they are to this building that we're in. Once you do that, you can see that your revenues are well above your expenditures and your building reserves. So you can see after 5 years you have a reserve. Granted, you want a higher reserve in the libraries, but you're running a 100% reserve of expenditures.
So Pete, before you go on there, please, Commissioners, we haven't had much of a conversation about this yet, but we've recently been talking with Minnie Simon, our library director, and just asking her the question, but as we approach this million person population, full-time population or beyond, what other library facilities are we likely going to need? The library right now uses a 15-minute drive time to a library as their standard for determining where the next library goes. And so depending, which ultimately becomes a policy decision, but if you use that 15 or 20-minute as the benchmark, then we can see that we're going to need probably another library in Lehigh Acres somewhere in not too distant future, and another one probably down south. When you take a look at the development patterns. Now, Pete's right. We had a lot of conversation about whether or not we should talk about taking this millage rate to roll back. So just recognize that, yes, these reserves are too high for the current condition, but if we decide we're going to build, then we would like to have another conversation about revenues being generated at the time of those conversations, but also whether or not there'd be a willingness to increase that millage rate for a short period of time. And we've done that in the past. So just those are policy considerations. We don't. That's not a decision to be made this coming year, perhaps a year or two out. But we always try to give you the heads up a couple years in advance of some of these major policy conversations we're going to have.
Makes sense. So you're going to recommend the rollback on the library millage fund then?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that makes sense.
So you can see the library rollback projection, 0.4714, and then you can see that, again, you have your expenditures exceed revenues. A part of that is because you're doing those 3 large projects in the next couple of years. After that, as Roger stated, we may have projects based on that million resident projection for the county, but we don't have anything defined enough, or the board has seen that we've got it in the projection at this point. So you'd end up with a reserve of about 81% after 5 years, based on the same projections that projection assumptions we're using for the other funds.
So I know so potentially, if we went with this scenario, that 34.2 million in ending reserves, that would be basically our capital fund if we wanted to build more libraries or something like that. But is that also the major maintenance fund for library facilities? These are big facilities. A roof is going to be expensive on one of them.
It is.
So it would come out of that? There isn't a separate maintenance fund for,
That's that fund.
okay, all right. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, Commissioners, and then we just wanted to really give you some good news about human services spending, but just wanted to, and I know you see this kind of discreetly one at a time as we bring agenda items forward, but just kind of show some of the funds that we've received for human services spending through the CARES Act and American Rescue Plan grants that go directly to our Human Services Department, $15.6 million. We did the CARES Act individual assistance last year that was both rent and utilities assistance, electric and water. And that was $28 million that was spent in the community. Food banks, we did spending of $6 million last year. We're currently engaged in emergency rental assistance, which is another program from the federal government that again pays for rent and utilities assistance. We actually have 21 folks in a group that are administering that program, working through all the applications. And then the last couple ones, one Partnering for Results, which the funding in this coming year's budget is the exact same as it was this year. There's no cuts to any funding. Everybody receives the same amount of money, and they're kept whole with what they're expecting in funding. And then the board-directed Shelter and Rapid Rehousing Initiative of $1.9 million that you approved several months ago. And, well, that all adds up to about $61.4 million. That all hasn't been spent yet, but a lot of it has. And just to go through your $1.9 million of the board-directed initiative, if I could have Mark Mora talk about this next slide, because there's some really good news that he's going to give you.
Okay, Mark, before you do that, I think Commissioner Hammond has a question.
Just a couple real quick, if you'll help me out, just so that I know where we're at. Have we exhausted all of so the first one was called CARES for COVID-19 relief. That was like 150 million, 149, something like that. 134, okay. Have we exhausted that fund? Have we used all of that 134 yet?
It is nearly exhausted.
Nearly exhausted? Okay. And do we have what's left of it programmed? We do?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, we do.
So then, after that, there was the first tranche from the American Rescue Plan, which is like 75 million, if I'm remembering correctly. Have we received that?
Yes.
Okay. Have we programmed that yet?
Not yet. We will be coming to you on this August 17th to discuss, to begin the discussions of that. That's a 4 or 5 year timeline, and they're bigger projects.
Okay. And then we get a second tranche of 75 million in a year? Is that how that goes?
Yes.
Okay. And then, so would we discuss both of them at the same time at that August 17th meeting? Or I just want to make sure that how we use that money appropriatly and how we budget it.
I think August 17th, our intent isn't to get into exact dollar figures yet. It's to talk about kind of where we want to, what we're looking to spend the money on, what the board's looking to spend the money on.
Pete, isn't the challenge really that we're trying to get some definitive guidelines on how we could actually use those dollars and what we're allowed to? I mean, I think there's still not a lot of clarity relative to those rules and what we're allowed to appropriate, what we're not. Isn't that the challenge we're in right now?
Glenn, I don't know if you have anything to add, but what we want to show you is what the clarity is that we have now on what areas potentially that could be spent on, what types of projects, and really more of an overall, a very high-level conversation as opposed to getting into dollar figures at this point.
You know, and a good resource for us on that clarity part is the National Association of Counties, NACO. They had their executive director at the FAC meeting in Orlando at the end of June. And he told the audience there of commissioners that basically NACO was very intimate in the writing of that part of the American Rescue Plan, that they are writing even the guidelines and helping Treasury answer some of the questions about how it's used. So I think they'd be a really good resource as we work through that process to understand.
And then Mark's going to talk a little bit about our rapid rehousing.
Thanks, Pete. Good afternoon, Commissioners. In addition to those larger tranches of direct allocation monies from CARES Act, we've received some through HUD in the form of CDBG and ESG, and we've coupled those monies with the direct allocation from the general fund that you Commissioners had directed for our Family Transition Collaborative. But I just want to give you a quick update. If you can recall, the Rapid Transition Collaborative was a collaboration with the City of Fort Myers. We employed the HOT teams, and we looked at parks, particularly Lions Park, but also county parks and libraries, and moving the homeless from those parks into temporary housing in the hotel in hopes of getting them in through the rapid rehousing program. And I'm really excited about the success we've had in the program. Overall, we sheltered about 73 people, 49 households. 29 households, which comprised of 41 people, have already been housed through the rapid rehousing program. We do have a handful of folks still in the hotel, and a majority of those we're anticipating to be placed in the Castle's Cypress Village project off of Winkler here in the next couple of weeks. So effectively, we would have cleared all of these parks of homeless, put them in temporary housing, and then they had a gateway into permanent housing through several different programs. So really excited about that program. Later in the year, we talked to you all about the Family Transition Collaborative. Came out of the fact that we had several families on the Connect list wanting housing, and as a commission, you all directed staff to look at a program that would help place them into permanent housing. So we commenced that whole program on June 1. This is the $1.9 million that you've allocated out of the general fund. So we separate them into two hotels. One is families and committed couples, and the others are families. So we currently have two hotels. In the families with children, we have about 167 people housed. 19 of those went into permanent housing. We do have several folks still in the hotel in that program. We've had some challenges with finding landlords that want to participate in the program, but we're seeing it ease up. So we're looking forward to getting all those people housed over the next couple months. And then we have the committed couples. You all wanted us to look at those families that weren't children-oriented but had a committed couple. So we have 35 people that entered that program. 2 people have exited as a household. We have 16 households remaining in the hotel. So our objective is over the next few months to get all of these people placed into a permanent housing. Cypress Village might be a solution for some, but a majority of them will go into the rapid rehousing program. In addition to those 2 programs, we have been running a non-congregate sheltering program. We started way back at the very beginning of the pandemic, working with the Department of Health and placing any of the homeless folks that had tested positive or have been ordered to isolate by the Department of Health. We've been placing them in temporary hotel. So we've had 113 people come through that program. Unfortunately, we've seen a uptick recently. There are 4 participants now. Roger texted me just prior to the meeting that we had another one put into the hotel for isolation. They typically stay for the 10 days, and then they're released. But it's also a gateway for us to connect them with services and housing as well. So we're really excited about the success of these programs. And as I said before, we're looking to have all these people housed in short order.
Real quickly, I appreciate the work you've done on this, Mark. Fantastic. Glad to know that instead of, sleeping on the street or in a car, these folks have a roof over their head while they wait to get on the rapid rehousing. I understand the challenge that you're facing with getting landlords to take in folks, especially with the market being as good as it is right now, and rents being as just market rate rent is very good. Let me ask this question. What kind of wraparound services are these families and committed couples getting while they're in the hotel? And is it possible that through the support and wraparound services they're getting, they may be able to just exit into market rate housing?
That's a great question. And each of the folks that are put in one of these programs have a case manager. And there are some cases, Commissioner, that some of them have exited out the program and found housing on their own. What type of services? That's a great question. Well, they do have a behavioral health specialist assigned to them. Our team has actually developed, I would call them job fairs, if you will, at both hotels. We've partnered with Goodwill, as well as our own human resources department. So we've hosted those on site, trying to connect people with employment. And obviously, there's a whole host of other services from a social aspect that we provide. Services, they have all of the services at the Salvation Army's Homeless Day Resource Center available to them as well. So I would say that a lot of them are connected on a day-to-day basis, and they provide the services that they need, because they all have unique needs.
Right. So they're not just in limbo waiting in a hotel to be helped someday. They're getting help right now and potentially could even move on to something bigger and right out of the hotel into, like you said, market rate housing or something like that too.
Yeah, absolutely. There's contact, if not on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. Our team also does rounds there. I know Jeannie and Roger set up shop there a couple times a week. So we do have people on site. The hotels have been wonderful partners for us and really engaged with helping us with these folks.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then, Commissioners, you have a hard copy of this, but this is all the PFR agencies and the funding they received this year and next year. Hasn't changed, and our recommendation is also to keep the same allocation for fiscal year 22-23. And then after that, we would probably have a conversation with the board about if there are any changes we want to make to this program. A lot of that roadmap may be dictated by what gaps we see, especially with all of the current funding, federal funding we're receiving, American Rescue Plan funds, and just what conditions are in the community at that point. And that's 5.71. That's 5.1 million of general funds. So with that, Commissioners, the questions: is there anything else you would like to consider? And we've taken note of all the input that you've given us throughout this session. And then, should we proceed to a third draft at this point, or just go ahead and go to public hearings?
I'm good with it. It's a great presentation. I thank staff and everybody's worked together on this. I mean, it's a tremendous budget. If you look at what we're doing, we're everything from kayak launches to funding the sheriff's department, roads, all the different parks, and this is a great budget. And I'd like to commend Roger and all your staff for put this together, and I'd be happy to vote for it. And we're reducing taxes too. I mean, what else can you ask for?
I mean, I'm comfortable with just going to a public hearing. I don't think there's another need for a workshop. I think we've covered what we have. There's some things we can cover with some excess reserves and some other opportunities, but I don't think we need another workshop to do that.
A question on partnering for results that we were just on. Did you say earlier, I missed it here, that the gross funding there is identical to last year? Or was there some factor put into that gross PFR?
No,
budget?
and one of the reasons for that, Commissioner, is that we're covering a lot of gaps with all of the federal money that we've received. So really what this shows is it's the exact same agencies, same number of agencies, and same amount of funding. And a lot of these agencies will benefit from both the federal funding and potentially American Rescue Plan funds, which we'll talk to you about on the 17th.
Well, that partially answers the question, but it totally answers the question in the sense that these are the same gross dollars for the coming year, and they're dealing with the same inflation factors that everybody else is. And I just want to say that I, for one, and I bet y'all share my thinking on this, want to pay close attention to the partnering for results as this year goes on, and let's be sensitive to the world that they live in too, particularly if we've held them paralyzed for a year.
I agree, Commissioner.
The last thing I kind of wanted to discuss, Commissioners, with you is, so we put this budget is, as Commissioner Pendergrass said, fantastic. It really is. We've done everything in this budget from fully fund 2020 to answer some really amazing things that the sheriff needed, that also, our community needed through the excess reserves. So it's always uncomfortable to talk about money and raises and that kind of stuff, but we're going to, our county attorney and county manager are contractually obligated to get either a 4 to 6% raise at some point here in the fall. I was wondering, looking at what we had budgeted for 3% for our employees, but what about, what would be the impact of raising the employees up to 4% so that they're getting the same as what our contracted employees are getting? Everybody did such a good job throughout this last year. I think certainly it would be worthy if we can, if it's something we can afford.
Pete, the value of one additional 1% is?
In the general fund, it'd be $955,000. Overall, it'd be a little over $2 million, all funds.
So I think to your point, Commissioner, I mean, there's $34 million still left over, so I think we could have conversations. And where I was looking for some clarity on the American Rescue, is I've heard different variations from different people, what you're able to do with that, one-time bonus. There's just a lot of different things. But I agree with your sentiment. There's still a lot of money left over to give us options and obviously take care of certain things. I couldn't agree more with you thinking.
Okay. What do you think is the next step for that then? Is it something we want to look at as we get closer to the?
Commissioner, with your permission, we will we'll model that along, we'll just add it to this presentation we just made. And instead of 3%, we'll model it at 4%. We'll show you exactly what that looks like, but it's actually pretty simple. It's another $900,000.
And I think what we talked about is what opportunities are there available to us to deploy the capital in the best way we possibly can of that remaining $34 million. So I'd love to have staff just give us some opportunities there to obviously help our area come back, obviously invest back in our area, and different options to utilize the funds to the best of our ability.
I would second Commissioner Hammond's comments because, we got to look at what the cost of living is right now in our area. We talked before in our past meetings, the cost of everything from food just to commodities in our area. The housing's going up, and I know everybody always says 3% is that magic number. We talked about before how we get that, pull that number out of the sky, but the reality of living today and the cost of everything is going up. It's just, I think we should definitely consider that if we can afford it, though.
Okay.
I agree.
Good.
Well, a broken record, Mr. Chairman, but I'm still open here to partnering for results. They're just zero, and we're talking about giving raises to folks that were already built in at 3%. We're going to add to that, and we're just going to then close this page and say, wait till next year.
I'm not looking to close that at all, Commissioner. What I envision is there's $34 million left over, so we can have a robust conversation. We just had a conversation about potentially another percent, and that costs us $1 million. There's $33 million left over, so what I envision is looking at American Rescue dollars and making sure that, what do they get from that? What do they get from us? So we look at the total allocation. I couldn't agree with you more, but we do have options with that $33 million. And among the options, we could be some projects and miss some, trying to take care of human services. There's many things that we collectively as a body, generally as a workshop, my understanding is we just give direction, and I'm just looking for opportunities and suggestions on the $34 million. But I didn't close my ears to your suggestion. I'm right on par with you.
Well,
100% on par.
as staff is reviewing the 1% and the $900,000 there, and how you're going to bring us perhaps some option at the next hearing, which we're going to decide whether it's going to be a hearing or a budget hearing, workshop.
The percentage, in my mind, the percentage was a calculation, okay? And that will take away from the 34 to 32. We could then, as a board, say, you know what, we look at this list, we want to give another $500,000, we want to give another $1 million proportionally. Because then we have 33 million, then we have 32 million. That's a type of conversation we could have. I just want to know what the calculation was. This is pretty straightforward.
We've only got one more opportunity, really, to have that conversation, or two.
With 2 public hearings.
Well,
And, I thought staff could bring us back some recommendations as we all talked about, but I agree with you, Commissioner.
well, let's have something on, marked for our agenda for the next hearing, whether it's the first of two or the final workshop.
At the
I
very-
don't need the workshop.
I know-
We can deal with this certainly at a public
But
hearing.
we could potentially look at, another 10%, another $500,000, what's that look like, or $1 million, we could look at that.
Well, then, let me join you in asking the staff to bring us some numbers to look at as it relates to partnering for results.
Yes, sir.
Also, whatever we can get clarity on American Rescue, that would help a great deal too, because, I'm happy they're getting that, but I agree with you, Commissioner, I do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioners.
I see what you're saying, Commissioner Mann, so if you just maybe increase the bottom, so if you increase the $5 million by 5%, that's $250,000 spread across all the,
That's,
Or 10% is 500,000. I mean, I just look at, I think we could have an easier conversation, but I was hoping staff could give us some suggestions on the remaining $30-odd million. So how do we deploy that the best? And there's some options, and then we could have a conversation. I think we whittle it down, but I think we've identified a good amount of projects. We've gone back to rollback rate. We've accomplished a lot, so we'll digest and see how this all pans out. I think Pete's gonna have a few extra dollars for us. Sales tax will come in, there'll be some pluses and minuses. But, we could do one more workshop. I just thought in 2 of our meetings, we could certainly have a little bit longer conversation. I know you do them in 20 minutes, but it might take 30.
I'll commit to it.
But I agree with you, Commissioner. I would love to see at least 10%.
Thank you. I mean, I look forward to that conversation, and it seems also just a part of fairness as we're looking at the total budget.
I'd like to see at least 10% increase.
Okay, so Commissioners, we'll prepare some recommendations for you on partnering for results with a 10% increase to the bottom line. Also some analysis on how we can spend the rules for spending the American Rescue Act dollars, see how much of that can be dedicated to human services, and then how much can they actually spend in 1 year. These organizations have pretty limited capacity, and we've talked for a few years now about improving their infrastructure and ability to provide more service. So that we'd like to add that to the conversation as well.
Sure, good idea to me. Well, look, while I'm
Yes, sir.
interrupting again here, we've made up the rules in a lot of cases here with this federal money that was dumped in our laps here. But I would like to commend one more time, starting at the very top and on down. This staff has done a remarkable job
Thank you, sir.
of grasping the enormous challenge in distributing those dollars and getting them done timely. So, yeah, and we're now, you want to do some more.
Good.
We good? So Commissioners, if I could, just before we go today, this will just take a second. We've said this often, that without this county commission, we can't do the work that we do. And you all have done a really great job in helping us understand what your priorities are. We couldn't do the work without the staff that we have. And let's start with the deputy county manager and the assistant county managers, and the leadership that they provide to the departments. And I look over here at all the departments are represented mostly by directors, but some others. And, a few years ago, we made the conscious decision to be the public sector employer of choice in the region. And you can see that it's really paying dividends. This group of people that are here today, back in the offices, working on the projects, all the work that gets done, we have handed them project after project after issue, and they have performed 100% of the time. And I know everyone will be very grateful for that additional percent. Can't thank you enough, but I couldn't be more impressed with the brain trust that we have here. it's really magnificent. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And with that, the meeting's adjourned.